So who are you?
My name's Lessig. I'm a professor of law at Stanford.
Yeah, and you've done a lot of interesting things in your life. You started Creative Commons, and you've argued cases with the Supreme Court, right? That's pretty interesting. But what and we could talk about those at length. I'd love to have 4 hours of your time and find out all about your Creative Commons experience or your classroom experience or whatnot. But I think this point in time is really interesting to talk to you because we're about to elect a new president, and probably one that's going to have different policies than the guy who's there right now. And we just visited Washington, D.C. a month ago and talked with a bunch of Congress people, both Republican and Democrat, and they laid out what they cared about, which matches a lot about what you talk about: network neutrality, bandwidth policy, advertising, and a whole range of things that we can get into. But a lot of them were like, we want somebody who is in the executive branch that we can talk to about science and technology. And Obama's put forth a CTO position, an idea. And I was thinking, what do you think that position should? What do you think that position should be for? And then, are you the right guy for the job?
So the answer to the second question is no. I'm not the right guy for the job. But the answer to the first question, which I think says something about why I don't think I'm the right guy for that job, is that I think the CTO, in some sense, has got to make the government make sense from the standpoint of technology and policy that's important to the government. So our government is committed to certain fundamental values of efficiency and transparency and privacy, accountability. And technology can help all of those values work better. And what I think one job of the CTO has got to be to set a standard that begins to influence decisions across the government about how the government implements its policies through technology, and begins to be sensitive to the way in which technology can help or hinder advancing technology policy. So, for the law of cyberspace, or cyber law, has been all about the trade-offs between technology and policy. And I think the CTO has got to be someone who has a sensitivity to those trade-offs, but also has very strong, real geek cred. I'm just a geek wannabe, not a real geek.
So you're hoping a CTO actually drives technology into, let's say, the Census Bureau, which is still largely being run on paper, right? Or helps a couple of the congressmen, John Culberson, said he wants to use technology to make the government more transparent to his constituency so that his constituency can see where they're spending money and where they're doing things, and so that they can have a better voice in terms of running the government.
Right. I think what the government, there's extraordinary opportunity for technology to actually make government work better. And work better here doesn't mean just spying on our citizens better. Work better means build the infrastructure of government so that government can protect values that are fundamental values to us. So that's what I think a CTO does. On the other hand, the government does need better advice about science and technology. And there have been institutions in the past that have tried to play this role. The Office of Technology Assessment, the OTA, historically has played a very important role. It's gone now, but it used to be a place where there was real analysis of technology and scientific issues that members of Congress could rely upon. And I think that it would be great to have more of that inside of Washington. But one real problem here is so long as Congress is really worrying about how it's going to raise money to get elected, then all of this input by experts or disinterested sorts is not really going to help until people can afford to listen to good advice as opposed to advice that gets them more money in their re-election campaign.
So tell me a little bit about how that corruption works, right? So I'm a congressman or a senator, and I'm trying to work on, let's say, broadband policy, right? I think we're 19th in the world right now and going down, not going up. So I want to reverse that trend, right? I want to get to number 10, maybe is my goal, right? Instead of number 19. That means I need the cable or telecommunications industry to spend billions of dollars to put wires and put wireless in so that we can get broadband into poor neighborhoods and broadband into my neighborhood, and I'm not even poor, right? You know, I don't even have good broadband in my house. And I can see Kyle McSlero, the CEO of the national and cable and telecommunications industry, coming and saying, hey, I need a back scratch. If I'm going to scratch your back, I need a back scratch too, right? We want to spend this money, but we need to be able to charge for it. We need to be able to charge the kid who's downloading movies every night and taking all of his network's bandwidth up a little bit more than another person like Rocky's going to get charged, right? Although Rocky's probably likely to be downloading movies too. But that's the argument that he sort of laid out for me, right? When I visited him was, hey, there's 1% of our customers are using 70 or 80% of our bandwidth, right? And we need to charge them differently than we charge other people. That's one argument to have. But you're saying there's another argument that'll come in, which is, hey, if you scratch my back, I'll give you money for your campaign or help your party get reelected or whatnot.
Yeah, the good news here is that there's fewer members of Congress than at any point in our history who are in the business to feather their own nest. In the 19th century, it was a cesspool of that kind of corruption. That kind of corruption is really not the problem. I mean, there's certain people, like Randy Duke Cunningham, who was a congressman who, basically sold his office to the highest bidder in a number of contexts, and that's of course terrible. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is when members are focused not on what the right policy is, but what policy will help them raise the most money. So when the cable television industry sits down with a member and says, here's what you got to know about how hard it is to build broadband and how much it's going to cost and what we're going to need and what kind of legislative policy we have to have, that's fine. I mean, in my view, that's what government's got to be about. You're going to have lobbyists. They're going to have to be there to explain the way the world works to members because they don't understand this sort of stuff, and that's just fine. Where the line gets crossed, though, when implicitly in that conversation there's an understanding that really what we're talking about is how are we going to help you raise money to get reelected or help you raise money so your party gets reelected. That's where it begins to corrupt the process, because then the member is not free to be thinking about what the right answer is or even what the answer is that his or her constituents will want. Instead, he or she's thinking about what's the way to raise the most money, and that's also a kind of corruption. Now, the particular issue, network neutrality here, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what neutrality means. So
straighten me out.
Yeah. So the first thing neutrality means is the thing that Michael Powell and now Kevin Martin have articulated as network neutrality, which is 4 principles. It at least means these 4 principles. And the 4 principles are basically that you have a right or the freedom to get access to any legal content, to run any legal application, to attach any device that doesn't harm the network, and to have competition in broadband access. Those are 4 core freedoms. And then there's a question of a 5th restriction, which is what the debate about network neutrality bills is about. Like, what's the additional restriction? And sometimes that's framed as you can't charge more for any bit than any other bit. All bits have got to be priced the same. I don't actually subscribe to that view of what network neutrality is. In my view, network neutrality is non-discrimination, but non-discrimination means treating like things alike. So if a cable television, if a cable broadband provider says to the customer, you want to get enough bandwidth to download all the movies you want, you're gonna pay more than my grandmother does. Right? I don't see any problem with that. That's historically the way we used to pay for access to dial-up networks. That's the same thing you pay for here. And I don't even think there's a problem if if the broadband provider says to Google, you want to have faster access for your video service, you're going to have to pay more than you do for your, just basic web access. So long as that cable provider offers the same price to everybody for that preference, I think it's fine. So it's a very narrow kind of restriction on what the broadband providers can do, but it's very important because the thing to worry about is that the platform owner, in a sense, begins to collude with the application or content provider to block out other competitors. So if Google gets to strike a deal with Comcast to have fast video access for YouTube and Google Video, but at a price that is lower than what Yahoo has to pay or Blip TV has to pay, then the two of them can work together as a way to protect Google and Comcast from the competition of these other people. That's the real thing to worry about. You need to make sure that the platform remains open for the next Google to come along and wipe out Google. And that's the real objective of network neutrality legislation.
Interesting. How would you fix the corruption problem, in Congress at least? Is there some systematic thing that you can do by, for instance, paying for public campaigns, or do you have some idea of what you would do to solve that problem? Yeah,
I think the first thing we got to think about,
or retard it at least.
Yeah, the first thing we got to think about is public funding for public elections. Now, a lot of people are very skeptical about this. On the left, people love it. On the right, people hate it. But I actually think people on the right need to wake up to why this is so important to them. I was once on a television show about this, and the guy said, no, you're completely wrong. What we need to do is get a flat tax. If we only got a flat tax, then there wouldn't be any of this corruption in Washington, and everything would work out. And I said to him, we will never get a flat tax so long as there's private funding for public elections, because the tax system is complicated in the way it's complicated because the government is buying off certain interests. So, they call up, chairman of a committee calls up and says, we're reconsidering this write-off for so-and-so type property. We're going to need some help in this election cycle to make sure that we got the right votes to support your write-off. And that drives money into the political process system. Or a story that is really striking to me is the story about Al Gore in 1994 trying to think about creating something he called Title VII in the Communications Act, which was going to be basically DSL and cable under one title. And that title was basically total deregulation. I mean, minimal interconnect requirements, but not even something like network neutrality, just basically deregulated. Staff takes this to the Hill. The Hill says, no way. How are we ever going to raise money from these guys if we deregulate them? So the point was, they're regulating. They're keeping their fingers as broadly dispersed into the economy as they can so that there are more places to create pressure to get people to give money back to Congress so that Congress can run for election. Now, if you had public funding, then at least the person on the right has a level playing field when he wants to come in and say, we should eliminate half the FCC, or we should cut back radically in the regulation in this particular place, because now there's no self-interest in preserving regulation in order to make sure you have money to get reelected. And same thing with flat tax. You could get to a flat tax if there wasn't such a huge incentive to make sure you had this complicated system so that you'd milk money out of private interest to run public elections.
Yeah. You were considering a run for Congress at one point. Are you still thinking of doing something in politics in the future? Or
well,
what part do you think you're going to play in this big game?
Yeah, so I'm certainly not going to run for anything, but I'm going to play
this year.
No, as far as I can see.
Okay.
This is not what makes sense. But I want to play a significant role in politics. If we could understand politics more broadly than running for office, I think we have a fundamental problem with the way this system works right now, at least as it relates to Congress. The influence of money in Congress, whether it actually buys votes or not, people believes it buys votes, which leaves people to think that the institution is just crooked. It's like a Enron balance sheet. There's just something fundamentally skew in what it does, and they recognize the politician. The character of a politician who, looks you straight in the eyes and says one thing, and that it's something else that's really going on. So there's no integrity or authenticity or trust in this institution. And what that means is people people have no faith in the truth of a debate. So the Congress votes against your interest. You learn that the congressman got money from those people. You're like, oh, I know why he voted that way. It's the money, as opposed to maybe I didn't persuade well enough, or maybe my argument wasn't good enough, or maybe we need more people on our side. So all the natural democratic responses are castrated in the system where people think what's really going on is the money. And so I think this is a really central problem in our democracy, because what's happened is our Congress has lost all authority. Right? Rasmussen last month reported 9% of Americans, for the first time in history, a single-digit percentage believes Congress is doing a good or excellent job. Right? For the first time. Soon it's going to be within the statistical margin of zero, right, who have any faith in this institution at all. And as people lose faith in Congress, more power shifts to presidents and to courts. And from the Democratic perspective, both of those are awful. All presidents are monarchs. All Democrat or Republican, they all want more monarchical-like power, unquestioned authority to do things like wage wars or whatever else they want to do. And all courts are anti-democratic because they're not elected. They don't care about being elected. So to the extent you extend power out of Congress to these other institutions, democracy gets weakened. So I want to be in politics in just the sense that I want to figure out a way to restore something in this balance. And what I've come to realize, absolutely convinced of now, even though I was not sure about it before, is that the best way to do that credibly is outside the system. So if I talk about this issue right now, and you think I'm running for Congress, then everything I say you're going to think is towards this ulterior motive. But if I have no ulterior motive about getting into government or getting anything from government, then you're going to listen to what I have to say. And I think that's the critical thing we need, is sort of authentic, credible arguments about this, as opposed to people you think always have something else they're jockeying for.
Yep. What are you seeing happen in the world? What are you seeing happen in terms of Stanford, in terms of Silicon Valley, and what should we care about that's happening here, I guess?
Well, one thing that I think Silicon Valley's got to care about is actually related to this issue of corruption pretty directly. Silicon Valley is filled with, maybe for the first time in history, all these innocent rich people, in the sense that, Rockefeller and Carnegie, they're people who made money by screwing other people, right? They're smart, they're great businessmen, but their money came through blood. They really, in some cases, literally buildings were blown up. But in other cases, it's really about how do we screw these people and get our way to the top. There's an extraordinary amount of money in Silicon Valley which came from nobody hurting anybody. Larry and Sergey, they didn't do anything to anybody, right? They just built.
Well, if you worked at Alta Vista.
Yeah, but the point is, they beat Alta Vista in the way that we all want people to beat other people. Right? They built a better product. People will say Microsoft, screwed people. I don't want to get into that issue, but a whole bunch of money in this valley has been made through people just being good and doing well, and they now are beginning to think about how they're going to affect the world in a way that can do good as well. But one thing that begins to happen is that as they become significant, other people are trying to beat them down through the legislative process. So one way to understand, the battle with Hollywood was exactly this traditional battle. You have all these new technologies, all these amazing ways to encourage people to do things with content, and then Hollywood comes in and wants to squash it, right? Well, people in Silicon Valley recognize they're bad at the government game. And
that's exactly why we visited Washington, and try to even start a conversation and see where the conversation points are. So people from Washington, people from Hollywood, they've been playing the government game for 60 years. People, the telecom industry for 100 years. Cable industry for 50 years. They're expert at this game. But people in Silicon Valley, they're novices. Okay, so you look at these people and you say to the head of Cisco or the head of Google or the head of Yahoo, you got to build a presence and you got to begin to play the game. You want good patent policy, you need to start funding elections to make sure that the right people get elected. And their first instinct is, yuck, this is horrible. I want to figure out
how to make a smaller hard disk, or how to make a router that can do 10 times the amount this router. I don't want to figure out how I can buy a congressman. That's disgusting. That's beneath me, right? So they have an initial kind of negative reaction to this whole political system, and my reaction to that is that's good. It's exactly the healthy reaction you ought to have. This system is broken, but you need to recognize unless you respond, the interests of Silicon Valley are going to get screwed. So what way to respond? Well, one way to respond is to become good at the system. I hope that's not how they respond, because the other way to respond is let's just change the system. I mean, you look at a company like Google that doesn't pause at kind of radically remaking all sorts of new markets, right? Here's an industry that used to exist. Let's wipe it out through this wild new technology that does all sorts of things for free that people used to think you had to spend money on. Same thing with, people like the Skype kids. Every new industry that come along, they just want to wipe out that intuition leads people to think, yeah, we can redo this. Because objectively, if you compare the difficulty of nanotechnology versus Congress, you would think nanotechnology is harder. Because Congress is just a bunch of people in a man-made institution, right? So if we could just get some of the...
but I've moved an atom across a piece of copper, or an iron atom across a piece of copper. Those things, while they bounce around when they get warm, they behave according to certain principles, right? People don't. People are random. I mean, I was on John Edwards' plane and looking at him having a sex scandal in front of me, and I had no idea, right? Yeah. People behave in very random and very unpredictable ways, and like you said, they can look at you in the eye and say one thing and do a completely different thing.
I don't think people are random. I think people respond to incentives in the right way, and the incentives are not just.
Interesting.
They're not just incentives about how do I become rich. They're incentives about how do I be good. How do I respect myself? How do I behave in a way that's respected by other people? And I think what we're going to do is to figure out how to manipulate this whole world of incentives to get the system towards a system where what government is trying to do is to figure out the right answer to hard public policy questions. Now, when government's doing that well, they still won't necessarily be the smartest people in the world or the most talented people for figure. But what we got to do is got to get a government filled with people who are really just trying to figure out the right answer from the standpoint of a democracy, as opposed to trying to figure out how to raise another $100,000, because that distortion will feed on itself to build this kind of K Street capitalism that we've got, where increasingly businesses think, well, if we spend $1 million on K Street, our return is actually higher than if we spend $1 million on R&D. Like, we make more money from government regulations that benefit us, tax benefit, whatever, than we do from new investment in new products. And so the K Street capitalism has become, I think, the most corrosive thing inside of our economy. And Silicon Valley is perfectly situated to fight that, because these people hate that. These people are producing real value through real innovation. And if we can just tap into some of that sense of what should be possible, I think we can.
Well, it's interesting. I had breakfast with one of the advisors of the Obama campaign, and we were sitting in a restaurant. He said, he told me, look around. He goes, I don't know how you landed this breakfast at this time, but around you are all these big money people who used to be able to buy the presidency through, bundling hundreds or millions of dollars together and then saying, hey, you want our money, you got to do X, you got to give me some access or something like that. And the internet has allowed campaigns now to raise money from guys like me, $100 at a time, right? Millions of dollars that way. That's changing politics.
Yeah.
It's not changing it as much as you want to. You want to see it, even a more wild idea to come along that changes it much deeper than just superficially like that. But you're seeing that, hey, you apply thinking and technology to a problem and it changes, right?
Yeah. There's no doubt there's been a radical shift because of the internet's capacity for raising money. And it might be that that shift is enough to deal with the problems of, electing a president. It might be that it makes sense to say in the general election, president can only have the money he can raise. I'd be happy to sign up to that as long as you say, and nobody can give more than $500. Then let's test and see who could actually win. But whether or not people like Barack Obama or John McCain are going to be able to inspire enough people to give them money to run a presidential election, we are never going to fund, at least as far as we can see, we're never going to fund House elections and Senate elections through this kind of small internet contribution. You're just never going to get that attention span.
Yeah.
So I don't think the internet solution is going to be a solution at that level. I think the only way to get a solution at that level is to spend the money on it. Now, people think this is a lot of money. It's not a lot of money. If you take the amount of money which the Cato Institute said government gave to special interests in 2001, that would fund public elections. That would fund public funding for public elections for 80 years in America, right? Just 1 year corrupted, the money that's been, given to private interests, according to Cato, illegally could fund 1/3 of the age of our democracy in public funding. So it's not a lot of money. We need to invest it in a way that makes sure that people can go to Washington and do the right thing, as opposed to do the thing that raises them the most money.
Yeah. What should the average geek out there who's working at Google or Microsoft or Yahoo, what should they care about? What should they be spending a little bit of their extra time thinking about or engaging on? What maybe 3 issues that you think the average geek should start caring about or looking at, watching, maybe
Yeah, I think that
thinking about, because the more people who think about something, the more gets done.
Yeah, I think that what we really need is innovation in leveraging the net roots to do something valuable.
Yeah.
We have this moment, maybe 5 to 8 years, where traditional interests don't quite get how to use the net, and it's only in these moments, these kind of breakthrough technology change moments, that there's a chance for some different kind of power to have some kind of effect. So we've got a really hard problem about how do we architect activism and focus it to get things done politically in the way that Jimmy Wales tripped on producing an encyclopedia by architecting it around a certain set of norms and a very basic wiki technology. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done with that stuff.
Is anybody doing stuff that's caught your attention that you think is an exciting idea?
You can see generations of it. It started with Dean, and obviously Obama campaign has been fantastic with it. MoveOn's been fantastic with it. We're hiring some of those people for Change Congress to do the very same thing around these issues. So that's a space where there's real potential and we need real progress. The other thing I think is, the geek is somebody typically who doesn't want to become a politician or spend his life worrying about politics. Well, if that's true, then what we need is at least enough of your time to fix the system enough so that you can not have to worry about it, right? If you want to just not pay attention, then at least you got to reset the balance so that the system can, in some sense, maintain itself. And that's why, I'm trying to get people to focus on these systemic issues as really critical, right? Because, again, I don't think Congress is going to get the right answer all the time if we fix these issues. But I'm not so worried about it, because if they're in a context where they can be focused on what the right answer is, then at least the mechanism of democracy can drive them towards getting the right answer. And we don't have to worry about it being skewed by this bending. But, I think about the image of true north with a compass, and I think basically what we've got now is a little magnet sitting right over here, or it's actually on the East Coast, so it's right over here, and it's skewing, the system. We're being misled because of that influence, and what we need is enough effort just to remove that, and then let the system function the way a democracy is supposed to function, and support for doing that is, I think essential. So, there's all this energy around network neutrality. Network neutrality wouldn't be a hard issue if there weren't so much money on the other side of the equation. And I don't mean money just because people are rich. I mean money because that's driving elections. Now, if you didn't have that money driving elections, then even though there's a lot of money on one side of the equation, at least policymakers could begin to kind of think about what the right answer is and get the right answer, even though there's a lot of money on one side. And so driving to that kind of reform, I think, is an essential part.
Yeah. Tell me about what your life is like right now. What are you working on? What are you thinking of? You started Creative Commons. How's that going?
Yeah. So
tell me what your everyday life is like here as a professor of law here in Stanford.
Yeah. So we launched Creative Commons about 6 years ago, and I announced about a year ago that given it seemed to be on its way and flourishing, I was going to move on to these issues. So I've stepped away from being the chairman and CEO, and now I'm just on the board. And my life is this mix of working as hard as I can on these corruption issues and continuing to be a professor and continuing to write and giving too much traveling and too much speaking. It's
When you talk with kids here, what kinds of conversations are driving them? What because the world's best and brightest comes here to Stanford. What kinds of things do you talk about here in the office if the cameras were off?
Well, the kids come to law school because they want to change the world. And by the end of law school, unfortunately, a significant number of them think, actually, what I want to do is, go to work for a big Wall Street firm. So the conversations are always trying to get them to think about how they can stay true to why they wanted to be a lawyer. And that's a hard struggle.
Anything else we should know about you or what you're thinking of?
It's a lot.
Yeah. Well, thank you so
Great.
much.
Thank you.